All right, everybody, welcome back. Get ready because we are taking a deep dive today into business analysis.
Yeah,
We've got this awesome training course document we're going to be pulling from today. It's really focused on real-world applications and getting you prepped if you want to take that certification exam.
right.
And we're also going to be getting into Kanban, which I think is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, definitely.
So this training document is super interesting. It goes over a lot of really important stuff like use cases and user stories
Hmm.
and all the different diagrams that you kind of need to know, like the use case diagram, sequence diagrams, and state diagrams.
Right.
But it does all of that through this one really cool example
Yeah.
about this material buyer at a manufacturing company,
Yeah. It's a great scenario.
XYZ manufacturing company. And this material buyer's job is to purchase all these raw materials
Yeah.
for building vehicles. So
Like aluminum or
aluminum.
stainless steel and all that.
Yeah. So the idea is kind of we're going to be walking through this scenario and thinking about like
Right.
how would a business analyst approach this whole
Exactly.
material purchasing process?
That's right. I mean, because the material buyer has to figure out what to buy, when to buy from whom,
Mm,
and under what conditions. And it's
right.
not as simple as just like placing an order. There's different flows that they got to
Right.
consider, different maybe hiccups in the supply chain, maybe different grades of material they need to get. So that's where a business analyst would come in and would help.
It's like creating this roadmap for the material buyer, right? To make sure that everything goes smoothly.
Exactly. Help map out all the twists and turns.
Yeah, and that actually kind of brings me to the Baybach Guide and these underlying competencies
Right.
that we see in Chapter 9
Absolutely.
of the Baybach Guide.
So the business analysis body of knowledge, that's what that stands for.
Okay.
It actually outlines these competencies that are really I guess, the secret sauce for any business analyst.
Yeah, and what exactly are these competencies?
Well, you can have all the technical know-how in the world, but if you don't have these
Right.
core competences,
Right.
you might not really excel.
Okay. And are these things that are going to be like directly on the exam or what?
Well, there are 6 key knowledge areas that are on the exam,
Okay.
but the exam questions might touch upon these underside competencies and techniques.
Oh, that's good to know.
That's why we're going over it.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a heads up.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about analytical thinking and problem solving and behavioral characteristics.
Okay, yeah.
What makes those so important for a business analyst?
So analytically thinking and problem solving, that's all about, you know, dissecting complex situations,
Right.
getting to the root cause and coming up with these innovative solutions.
Okay.
So in the case of our material buyer, maybe there's a bottleneck with a particular supplier.
Okay.
Maybe they need to find a new supplier that no one's even thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe they need to completely rethink the way that the supplier quotes are even evaluated.
Yeah, it's like you're a detective, but for business processes.
Exactly.
Okay. What about these behavioral characteristics? I feel like these are super important when you're working with all these different stakeholders.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. This material buyer is talking with the engineers that write the material specs.
Right.
They're talking with the suppliers that are giving quotes. They may even be talking with finance to get
Right.
budgets approved and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, you got to be able to communicate with these different stakeholders. You got to be able to negotiate and build trust with them.
Yeah, it's like you're this diplomat who's trying to navigate all these different personalities
Totally.
and make sure the project goes smoothly.
Yeah.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff, and I definitely want to get back to it. But before we do that, I want to talk about this Kanban methodology
Okay.
that we see in the training document,
Sure.
because it's not just some like buzzword, is it?
It's not, no. It's woven into this for a reason. It's a very practical methodology that emphasizes visualizing your workflow,
Okay.
limiting how much work is in progress at
Right.
any given time, and constantly looking for ways to kind of smooth out the process.
Okay, so it's kind of like how our material buyer needs a roadmap for their purchasing process. Kanban is like a roadmap for everyone on the team.
It is. That's a great way to put it. So we can break down these core Kanban practices
Yep.
a little bit further, but I think it's a great starting point.
Okay, cool. Let's do it.
Yeah.
What are these 5 core practices and how do they relate to our material buyer?
So let's imagine a Kanban board with different columns
Okay.
that represent each stage of the material purchase process. So we could have a column for request received.
Okay.
We could have a column for supplier quotes,
Okay.
order placed, material received, and so on.
All right, so each of these like tasks is represented by a card on this board.
Yeah, exactly. So the material buyer can visually see the progress
Okay.
of each task, and they can see where people are getting bottlenecked.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Okay. But this idea of limiting work in progress, that seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it's kind of like juggling. You can only juggle so many balls at once
Right.
before you start dropping them.
Right.
And the same thing's true with work. By limiting the work in progress, you're essentially making sure that each
Right.
task is getting the attention that it deserves.
Right.
And it ultimately leads to higher quality and faster turnaround times.
Okay, so it's like instead of the material buyer trying to get like, a dozen quotes at the same time, they're just focusing on like 3.
Exactly.
Getting those done and then moving on to the next 3.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I see.
It's all about a nice, smooth, efficient flow.
Yeah, okay. And we're going to talk about all these other core practices like managing the flow and making those process policies explicit a
Absolutely.
little bit later. But first, I want to circle back to these underlying competencies
Okay.
and kind of dive deeper into those. Why are they so critical
Yeah.
for a business analyst?
Great question.
Okay, so we've talked about these underlying competencies, and they really sound like they're important.
They are.
But how do they actually play out, like, in the real world?
Okay, well, let's take creative thinking, for example.
Okay.
It's not just about coming up with these like wild, out-of-the-box ideas. It's about being able to see the process
Right.
from different angles. So maybe there's a new supplier our material buyer hasn't considered before.
Okay.
Or maybe there's a more efficient way to evaluate those supplier quotes.
Okay, so creative thinking can kind of help them
Yeah,
look at all those different possibilities.
exactly, to challenge the status quo.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like looking at a puzzle and thinking about all the different ways to fit
Yeah.
those pieces together.
Totally.
But what about decision making?
Yeah.
I mean, our material buyer has to make a lot of decisions.
That's right. Every step of the way, there are decisions to make. Which supplier do they choose?
Right.
How much material do they order? When do they place the order?
Right.
So strong decision-making skills are crucial here. They got to be able to assess the risks and the pros and cons, and then make informed choices that help the company reach their goals.
Okay, so it's like our material buyer is walking a tightrope,
Yeah,
and they have to make these decisions to stay balanced.
absolutely.
And speaking of balancing, I remember we were talking about learning earlier
Yes,
and how that's a competency.
absolutely.
I mean, in this business landscape, that's always changing.
Yeah, it's always shifting. New technologies, new demands,
Right.
global events that disrupt those supply chains.
Right.
Business analysts got to constantly be learning and adapting.
So it's not even just about what you know. It's about
Right.
how you can adapt and learn new things.
Exactly. In the material buyer's case, maybe there's some new type of sustainable material that's come out,
Mhm.
or there's a sudden price spike in aluminum.
Right.
They have to be able to just learn on the fly and adapt.
Yeah, very cool. So we've talked about the analytical thinking and problem solving, but what about the behavioral characteristics?
Yeah.
How do those come into play?
Well, remember how we were saying our material buyer is working with these various stakeholders, engineers, suppliers, finance folks.
Right.
This is where those behavioral characteristics
Okay.
really become critical. So we're talking about ethics, accountability, trustworthiness,
Okay.
organization, time management, and adaptability.
Okay, that's a lot.
It is.
So ethics, why is that so important?
Well, think about it. Our material buyer is in charge of spending the company's money,
Right.
and often a lot of it, they're
Mhm.
dealing with suppliers, they're negotiating contracts. There's a lot of potential for ethical dilemmas to arise.
Okay.
So, do they choose the supplier that offers some personal incentive,
Right.
or do they stick to the ethical guidelines and choose the supplier based on merit?
Right.
So integrity is really important here.
Okay. So it's like you need to have this moral compass that's guiding you
Yeah,
as you're making these decisions.
that's right.
Okay. Now, what about accountability?
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
Accountability really goes hand in hand with ethics. So our material buyer needs to own their decisions,
Mhm.
good or bad. Let's say a shipment is delayed. They got to take responsibility,
Right.
figure out what went wrong, and then tell everyone who's affected what's
Okay.
going on.
Okay, so it's about being reliable and following through on your commitments.
Exactly. You got to be dependable.
And trustworthiness. I feel like that's just kind of a natural
Yeah.
extension of accountability and ethics.
It is. It's about building those strong and reliable relationships.
Mm-hmm.
The engineers got to trust that our material buyer is going to give them accurate information
Right.
about pricing and availability. And the suppliers need to trust that they're going to negotiate fairly
Right.
and honor any agreements that are made.
Okay, so it's really not just about crunching numbers.
It's not.
It's about building relationships and trust.
It is. It's all about transparency and communication,
Okay. But you haven't even talked about organization and time management.
right?
I feel like those are really important
Oh, they're crucial.
for a business analyst, right?
Yeah, think about it. Our material buyer might be dealing with all kinds of purchase requests at the same time,
Right.
each with its own set of deadlines and specs and different stakeholders. So they got to be masters of organization,
Yeah.
prioritizing their tasks,
Right.
scheduling meetings, keeping track of all the moving parts.
It's like conducting an orchestra. You got to make sure all the instruments are playing together.
That's a great
in
analogy.
harmony.
Yep.
And then lastly, adaptability.
Yes.
We talked about how the business world is constantly changing.
Always in flux.
So our material buyer has to be able to adapt to that.
Absolutely. Let's say a supplier suddenly goes out of business.
Right.
Or there's some natural disaster.
Right.
That affects the supply chain. They got to be able to think on their feet and come up with solutions.
Yeah, it's like you're playing chess.
Yeah.
And you have to think about all the different moves.
Totally.
Okay, so I'm really starting to understand how important these behavioral characteristics really are.
Yeah, they're essential for any business analyst.
Okay, cool. Now, before we move on too far, I want to get back to this Kanban methodology.
Right.
We've talked about visualizing the workflow and limiting work in progress, but what are some of those other
Yeah.
core practices in Kanban? So let's get back to Kanban. We were talking about visualizing the workflow and limiting work in progress.
Right.
What about these other core practices of Kanban?
Well, next we have manage, flow, and measure. Sounds kind of technical.
Yeah.
But it's really just about keeping things moving smoothly and efficiently. Think about it like a river.
Okay.
You don't want any dams or blockages preventing the water from flowing.
So we're making sure those purchase orders aren't getting stuck somewhere.
Exactly. Let's say our material buyer's waiting for a supplier quote,
Mhm.
and the supplier's taking forever to get back to them.
Right.
That's a bottleneck that holds up the entire purchase.
Right, right.
So by managing the flow, the material buyer can see that bottleneck and
Right.
try to fix it.
Okay, so how do you actually measure the flow? Is there some...
Yeah, that's a great question.
Good to do
So
that.
Kanban team actually track key metrics like lead time,
What?
which is the time it takes a task to go from start to finish.
Okay.
By tracking those metrics, our material buyer can see, are there certain materials that take longer to get?
Right, or certain suppliers.
Or certain suppliers that are always slow to respond.
Right, right.
And that helps them figure out what they can improve.
Okay, so you're constantly monitoring to try to improve.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, so what about these process policies? What does it mean to make them explicit?
So you know how sometimes it's unclear who's supposed to do what and when?
Right.
That's where making process policies explicit comes in.
Okay.
It's about getting everyone on the same page.
Okay.
So in the material buyer's world, this might be like setting clear criteria for choosing suppliers.
Okay.
Or setting a standard process for approving purchase orders.
Yes.
Things like that.
Okay, so it's like a clear instruction manual for the whole purchasing process.
Exactly.
Everyone knows the rule.
Everyone's on the same page.
Okay, cool. So last but not least, we've got this idea of improve collaboratively.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of teamwork, but how does this work with Kanban?
Kanban's all about constantly improving.
Okay.
It's not a one-time thing. You're always looking to do things better. And the best way to do that is to use the knowledge of the whole team.
Okay.
So the material buyer could have regular meetings with the engineers to talk about
Right.
material needs, or they could brainstorm ideas with other people about how to choose suppliers.
Right.
Or maybe they could get feedback from finance about how to manage the budget.
Right.
Stuff like that.
Okay, so it's like a feedback loop where everyone's involved
Exactly.
in making things better.
That's it.
I love that. Okay, so today we went over a ton of information about business analysis and Kanban.
Yeah, we did.
What are some key takeaways our listeners should remember?
I think the most important thing is that business analysis isn't just about technical skills.
Right.
It's about critical thinking, problem solving, and those behavioral characteristics that we talked about.
Yeah.
It's also important to remember that Kanban's not just for software development.
Right.
You can use it for any process, even your personal workflow.
That's a great point. Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. We talked about this material buyer today, but we all face similar challenges in our own work.
That's true.
So how can we use all this great information about business analysis and Kanban
Right.
to be more efficient and successful in our own work?
Something to think about.
It is. That's all the time we have for today, but keep thinking about that, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.